Rook endgames, and the king is on the edge. The last two videos were on Rook endgames active Rook, which Dvoretsky reckons is the most important thing. You've got to activate your Rook. Even at the expense of a passive king, it's usually a good idea to activate your Rook. But then the thing you want after that, if you've got an active Rook, if you can have it as well, is an active king. Now the opposite of an active king is of course a passive king, and a subset of passive king is a king on the edge. So here is a king on the edge. White's king's not looking particularly clever either, by the way, in this position. But and both sides have got an active Rook. But here we have a king on the edge. Now there's two reasons a king on the edge is bad. One is you need an active king, because you want to attack your enemy's weak pawns. But also, yeah, you want to support your own passed pawns. It's just good to have an active king. But the other reason a king on the edge as a subset of a passive king is a bad thing is that it can become embroiled in possible mating nets. The king being on the edge of the board is not just about it's not active, it's that it can be got, basically. You know, that the opponent can weave a mating net around it, or the threat of a checkmate that just leads to irretrievable material advantage, or sometimes gives them a draw, for example. So we've got 4 positions in this video to go through, and all of them have that theme that the king being on the edge and mating threats just gave the side that was making those mating threats the advantage they needed to get the desirable result. In this case it's going to be a win, but sometimes in the other positions it's going to be a draw in what seems like a pretty dodgy position. So, like I say, White's king's not looking particularly clever either in this position. This is an endgame from 1924. Capablanca is white, it's white to play. This endgame I have seen analysed by virtually every chess commentator on YouTube. It's got to be one of the most famous Rook endgames in the world ever. It's clearly a case study that all the classical chess trainers seem to think that everyone should know about. It's white to play. What should we do? And we can see that this king isn't particularly clever if we just follow a policy of collecting pawns. Okay, so rook d7, rook takes c3 check, and already the white king is forced backwards onto the second rank. Now the white king's not on the edge, but it is passive, and it has been, forced back by this black rook. And white's pawns, they're not looking particularly clever. This one's looking very clever. The other 3, they're looking like they're going to get picked off. Okay, now Dvoretsky writes that after rook a3, we see a bit of pawn chomping, and this position is unclear. Now the engine's got that as +2. Okay, I mean, I think it's unclear. Even though the engine says it's +2, I'd rather be white, but I wouldn't just say, oh yeah, give me this position as white and I'll just beat anyone with it. I could easily see myself chucking away this +2 advantage. In fact, wouldn't be surprised to see Stockfish beat me from here. It seems to perform miracles. It's a position that's clearly not just, oh yeah, that's just a win for white. Okay, there's complications there. We'd rather have these 2 passed pawns than these 2 passed pawns, but they're 2 passed pawns, and that could get complicated. Also, after this rook d7 move, we don't have to attack the a pawn with rook a3. I mean, the engine reckons that c6 is a draw. It's objectively drawn. There's nothing unclear about it, although I still think it's unclear. So rook c4, attack the d pawn, defend the d pawn. Bit of a swap. Black's attacking this pawn. Now the engine reckons it's analysed this to the end, I suppose, and it's just got this as just dead drawn. And I believe it because it's an engine. But we have passed pawns all over the place here, and that's going to be, I mean, you can see there's lots of play left in that position. It's not just like, oh, that's just drawn between any old idiots. It's probably a draw. In fact, objectively, apparently it is a draw. But there's play left there, isn't there? Both sides would have to work very hard. This black king's still on the edge. This white king's still not looking particularly clever. I mean, it's in the middle of the board, but it's still cut off, and it's cut off on a rank where white's weak pawns are. And Yeah. Anyway, back to the original position. Whether we go for the position that's unclear but the engine reckons is +2, or we go for the position that the engine reckons is completely drawn, although as far as I can tell it is still quite hard to sort of assess. At the moment, the engine reckons that if you play the move that Capablanca played, you've got a +4 advantage, and everything else is just objectively drawn. And we can also see from a human perspective in a few moves' time that if we play the move that Capablanca played, then this is a reasonably easy position. It's reasonably easy to win this position. In Rook endgames, I've found it's not so much the number of pawns you've got, although obviously that is important. It's the number of quality pawns you've got. This pawn is top quality. This rook is in a massively good position. It's cutting the enemy king off on the back rank. The king is on the edge. This king is not in a clever position. And Dvoretsky talks about if we follow Nimzovich's principle, which is to just attack with all our forces at once, active king, get our king into the action, even if it means dropping all of these weak pawns, we just don't care. If our king can get into a strong position and then all of a sudden we've got mating threats against the black king, I mean, it's going to be obvious in a 3 or 4 moves time. It's like, oh yeah, that was a good idea. And I guess the point is then we just sort of try and do these things in our games ourselves. Anyway, I think I've given away the first move, which is to get that king up the board. King g3, this is what actually happened in this 1924 game. Rook takes c3 check, king h4. Now this looks a bit dodgy at first, lining up your king and rook here. I mean, black could just keep going after pawns, as he did in the game. But you might be wondering, well, why doesn't black do this? Rook c1. And the point is that white can just play king h5, and yeah, black might play c5 or something there, because the rook coming to h1 isn't a problem. Okay, we just sidestep the check, activate the king even more, and if the white king ends up on h7, this pawn's just coming straight through. So rook c1 doesn't really achieve anything. It was probably put there by whoever just played rook c1 with the intention of that rook h1 check, but the rook h1 check doesn't achieve anything. So black might then think to push the c pawn, but this is going to be pretty similar to the game now in the sense that it's just too strong. Okay, well, we've got options of maybe coming to f6, threatening some checkmates, or rook f7 check first and then disappearing to threaten a checkmate, and the g pawn is just coming through. It's just completely over. So not rook c1. In the game, like I say, rook f3 was played. The move that all the analysts down the years have talked about as being the one that black should try is a6. Now the engine reckons +4, but the point of a6 is that black's going to start creating a passed pawn of their own, and that's going to mix things up a bit. Like I said, the engine's saying +4, but probably just continue with king h5. But then black starts creating this pawn, and there's way too many variations to go through here. I'm not going to be able to go through them in an exhaustive way, so just some example ideas, example lines, just to show that although the engine's saying +4, we can get some positions where white can go wrong. So apparently g6 straight away, for example, would be a mistake. So instead, activate that king, king g6, and then black takes on a4. So hang on a minute, that's a passed a pawn there. That's looking pretty dangerous. Rook f7 check, king g8, rook takes f5. Black can force the white king back off the 6th rank, and there's different things that black could try here. You might be wondering, well, why don't they sort of create a block on the rook getting to the a file? And that's actually quite a good move. White would have to play this, and white's still winning this. It's like a +3.5 advantage, because of these 2 pawns are just going to be too strong. But it's different to the game. But it's different to the game in a way you can see that, well, this was a better defensive try for black than what we're about to see. Or instead of rook d6, black could play rook b6, so that when white nabs the d pawn, then we'll block the white rook getting to a5. So white might think to come around the back, at which point, if black plays rook a5, sort of defending this and marching this one to victory, the g pawn's coming through quicker. Or in this position here, if black just gave up on that and realised the g pawn's coming through quicker and went after white's f pawn, king g4, so that's forced the white king back a bit, which is an advantage, then go after the d pawn. We might see these sorts of lines, and again it's +4 still, because these two are stronger than these two. Okay, well we can all see that, but there's still an endgame there, which we could cover. We could go through, okay, how do we win it from here? Let's talk about endgame technique, which I'm not going to do. This is a different sort of game, but that's what the commentators were pointing out, that a6 was black's best try there. The whole point of this video is just to demonstrate that the king on the edge, and in a few of the example lines there, we saw that the black king sort of was able to get off the edge because white had to go snapping up pawns with the rook. Anyway, in the game, rook f3 was played. Capablanca just pushes the g pawn. Rook takes f4 check, king g5. And what I find sort of quite amusing here, I mean, it wasn't played in the game, but if black plays rook takes d4, king f6, we started with 5 pawns against 5 pawns. It's now 5 pawns versus 2. And yet it's so obviously completely and utterly lost for black. There's immediate checkmate threats. If the king moves, or if the king moves to e8, then we just bring the g pawn through. If the king moves to g8, we can just move the rook away, and the mating threats are still there. In fact, I think they're basically unstoppable. You can see it's just completely and utterly gone. Even though black's won 3 pawns. It's not about the number of pawns, it's about the quality of those pawns. And this king being on the edge was a problem. So in the game, the player with the black pieces did realise that and played rook e4, desperately trying to get their rook back to e8. So this at least gives them the chance to play king g8 and then stop checkmates with rook e8. But by doing this, they've left the d pawn untouched. And alright, they've gobbled up a couple of white's pawns, but now it's white's turn. And there's, black has to concentrate, because their king's on the edge, on defending all the mating threats, and then white can use that to just basically gain the insurmountable material advantage. Nice little endgame technique here. Capablanca chucked in this intermezzo check, just forcing the king to a square where the g pawn's going to come through with check. Nice little move. Still threatening a checkmate, so that black has to play rook e8. I think rook e8 was the only move there. And there's different ways that white can win from here. They don't have to, but Capablanca just kept it simple. Just took the f1. I mean, king f7 was fine as well. It gets a bit sort of convoluted. I did actually prep an example line here, and it's mating threats the whole time. Like rook h2 mate is being threatened here, so black's desperately doing everything they can to get out of that. The mating threat's still there, look. Rook g7 check. The mating threat has it sort of gone? Looking at rook, is rook c8 do anything there? It doesn't look nice, does it? Or black's saying it's fine. f4, rook h2 check, king g8, rook back to e2. Well, that's definitely a mating threat. So the king back to h8, and rook e5 was just, there's just one example line. White can keep using the mating threats to gobble up black's pawns while still having this absolute monster pawn on g6, which isn't too dissimilar to the game. Capablanca at this stage just took the f pawn. This king is still on the edge, and we've got this g pawn. I mean, it's actually 3-on-3 now, pawn wise, so the idea of dropping pawn doesn't matter. I mean, that's sort of gone now. Rook e4, king f6, mating threats again. Black's got to deal with that. They either play rook e8 and just, incredibly passive rook, or in the game this check was chucked in, and yeah, I'm not really sure why black now carried on. Nice little move there, g7 check. G7 arriving with check, remember, because we did that intermezzo rook g7 check earlier. And yeah, Capablanca just started taking all of black's pawns. I'm not really sure why black carried this on, but they did, so just go for the moves, and then finally they resigned there. Next, this is a game from 1941. It's black to play. You could pause the video and decide on a plan if you wanted to. What's your assessment of the position? Who's doing better? Ordinarily, you'd have to say that white's in a much better shape. I mean, they've got a passed pawn here. Black's pawns are just a mess at the moment. I mean, obviously this pawn, white's going to be doing incredibly well to hang on to that, so that e-pawn's a goner. But after that, white's just got 2 pawn islands, and their pawns are sort of nicely protecting each other, and the white rook's very well placed and can go and start attacking them all. It's 6 pawns versus 5 at the moment, isn't it? Already 5 on 5 because that pawn is going. Yeah, so what did black do here then? Like, how did Smyslov, who was playing black in this 1941 game, manage to sort it out so that he got a draw out of the position, which you'd be very pleased with here as black. I mean, again, the engine's saying it's drawn, but you have to play it well. And what he did, well, for example, if you just take on e3, just to show you that how precarious this is, that is now just winning for white. G-pawn's gone. It's just, again, one example line. King into f2. We might see these sorts of moves, and all of a sudden it's 4 on 2, and we have 2 connected passed pawns over here on the queen side. So, yeah, I mean, that's just over, I would say. So he didn't take on e3. He preserved the g-pawn. The main reason for preserving that g-pawn we'll see in a minute. I mean, you've got 2 sort of connected pawns here, which I suppose is better than leaving those 2 behind. But I don't think that's the main purpose of it. The main purpose of g5 we'll see in a sec. H-pawn gone. A-pawn gone. That was probably quite a good swap for black. Rook h6 check. King e5. That's the c-pawn gone. So black's pawns, we said they're a bit weak. They're just dropping that a little bit quicker than white's. And now Smyslov played king e4. That's another pawn gone. And then this is what I think the main purpose of g5 was. He's seen ahead. This white king is on the edge. And I said, you know, in rook endgames, it's not about the number of pawns you've got. It's about the quality of those pawns. In this case, it's not about the number of pawns that are dropping. It's about the quality of your rook and king at the end of it all. The active king and active rook, with the white king being on the edge, became the thing that got black the draw that he wanted. And quite a simple draw in the end. And Smyslov just created a little umbrella here with the g5 supporting that f4 pawn push. It doesn't really matter what colour that umbrella is. It's a black umbrella at the moment. White took it and made it into a white umbrella. But we don't mind what colour our umbrellas are. We are not racist when it comes to umbrellas in a game of chess. Black's now threatening checkmate in 1. White can get out of that checkmate, but only with a draw. And they agree to draw here, because there's nothing stopping that perpetual. White has 5 pawns, black has 1, and it's a draw because this king was on the edge. Next, this is a game from 2012. It is black to play. You could pause the video and decide what would you do here as black. What should your plan be? Formulate a plan. And well done if you decided that your plan was to do nothing. Sometimes you've just got to do nothing. White's not threatening anything. White has no threats. Our king is on the edge. Our rook's very nicely placed, actively attacking this pawn here. It's up to white to decide how to make progress. So black should just sort of mark time. King e8, king d3 perhaps, rook h5. Just do nothing and wait for white to tell you what they're up to. I mean, obviously you take white, 3 pawns against 2, but pretty hard to see how white's going to make progress there. I mean, if those 3 pawns against 2 get converted into 1 pawn against none, we can see that the Philidor position is going to be trivially reached there, isn't it, for example? In the game, black decided not to do nothing, but instead to play f5 check, forcing the white king back, right? Because the e-pawn's going to fall otherwise. King e5, completely winning for white, because the black king is on the edge. That e-pawn fell, king f6. Checkmate is being threatened. King g8 was played in the game. If instead king e8, we could see rook e8 check, king goes to d8, rook takes e6. Looking pretty hopeless for black. +6, engine reckons. So king g8 played in the game. White now sort of went wrong a little bit. This isn't the move that chucks away the win yet. Rook g7 check. It's in a minute, I think. The win gets chucked away. What white should do here is take advantage of the black king being on the edge by playing rook c8 check, and when the king goes to h7, then go king f7. It's an unbelievably powerful move here. The point is, obviously, the black king can't go that way because the rook's covering the h8 square, and the black king can't go that way because rook h8 is mate. Okay, because we've got a pawn protecting g5. And black's in a bit of a mess because their rook's trying to defend the e6 pawn. And if they carry on just defending the e6 pawn, then white can swing down and threaten this checkmate. Black's then got to do something about that, and then the e6 pawn falls. And the f5 pawn's going to fall. It's over. Okay. Or if black anticipates all of that and plays rook a3, so that rook coming down can be met with rook a7 check, the e-pawn just falls straight away. And again, it's just over. So that should have been white's winning plan from there. That rook c8 check followed by this king f7. Just taking advantage of this king being on the edge and all those mating threats that ultimately meant black had to drop this pawn in very unfavourable circumstances. Probably drop that pawn as well, and it was just over, with the black king sort of still being miles out of the game. In the game, white started to go wrong a bit. Rook g7 check, king f8, rook h7. Again, there was nothing wrong with just returning to the plan, and now rook c8 check. Rook h7 was played. Again, there's still nothing wrong with returning to the plan here. But this was the move that chucked away the win. Okay. Rook back to h1, and the black king isn't really on the edge so much anymore. So the black rook came into e4. Rook d1 was played. King h7 King h7 was a dreadful move. What black should just do here is just take this f pawn. Okay. Draw. But inexplicably, black played king h7. You could pause the video here and decide what would you do as white. They found the plan now, king f7, and black resigned. So even after white messed it up by not appreciating the power that they had at their disposal because the black king was on the edge, black then messed it up by not realising just how bad it was that their king was on the edge. In particular, that white pawn controlling the g5 square. Right, last position. This is a game from 1991. I've seen this in at least 2 different endgame books. It's white to play. Pause the video and have a long think about this one. This is really worth analysing, in my view. It's actually from a game, like I said. And white can draw this. I mean, even knowing that, it's... You know, because you get these games where you're losing, and can you find something? Is there something there? And there is something. There is something there. There is a way to draw this game. See if you can find it. So in the game, the player with the white pieces didn't find it. They just played pretty passively with Rook H1. The reason this is so bad is that black can afford to swap rooks on the H file because the white king is not going to be in the square of this C pawn. That's pretty crucial to all of this. It just gives black an absolutely massive, well, an unassailable advantage. H3 played, Rook H2 is a good principle to block those pass pawns as early as possible. Black just played a waiting move. King E7 apparently was a better waiting move, but fine. King G4, and then the black king comes in. If instead white played King G5, then black can speed things up a Rook G8 check. If the king goes to the H file, we can just get on with the plan. Okay, because this is just going to lead to the same problem as the game. Or if white insists on trying to stop us coming forward with our king, we've got Rook G3, and yeah, we're going to get white into a zugzwang there pretty soon, aren't we? And be able to bring the king forward. So yeah, that would have been a nice way to do that. So yeah, in the game, not King G5, King G4 played, and it's just over. I mean, that white actually just went down a suicidal route, to be honest, and resigned. The white king is not in the square of this C pawn or this C pawn. Okay. Well, I guess white gets to choose which C pawn they lose the game to. So not Rook H1 in the original. There's no way to defend this by being passive. And the way to defend it is by being active. We've got our king in a very, very active spot here. And the black king is not quite on the edge, but it's close to being on the edge. And we can use checkmate threats to get ourselves out of jail. When black pushes the H pawn, Rook B7 check, King F8. Now Dvoretsky writes that the player with the white pieces absolutely would have been able to see this position. By the way, that last move of black's, King E8 drops the rook, King G8 drops the game to King G6. Mating threats, black's had it. So King F8 was the only move. Yeah, and Dvoretsky writes that the player with the white pieces absolutely would have seen this. That, it would have been very easy to see this because King F8 is such a... Well, it's an only move. So this position would have been definitely foreseeable. But then how to follow it up? And there's lots of ideas you might have to follow it up, and the move you need to play here is not necessarily the most obvious one, and that's probably why they just rejected it and went for a passive defense, and yeah, and then just lost anyway. Let's look at some of the moves. So Rook B8 check is a move you might think to play. This is lost. King G7, Rook A7 check, and the black king runs away to H6. You've got to come back with the rook, and yeah, black's just going to steadily make progress there. There's not really much that white's going to be able to do. So Rook B8 check doesn't cut it. If you come in with the king, the problem with this is that black will just check you, King G5, and push the H pawn. Oops. So you think, all right, I will come into g6 then. The problem with g6 is that black can play rook h4. With similar ideas, by the way, after king g5, black could just push the h-pawn. And if instead white plays f5, h2, rook a8 check, king e7, f6 check, king d7, f7 maybe, but black's queening first, and yeah, whatever white promotes with. I suppose they could promote with a knight if they wanted to. That's not really going to get very far, is it? Once they've promoted, it looks like they're getting mated there. Even f8 equals knight check is checkmate in 8. I feel like f8 equals queen is going to be mate in 2, maybe. Like mate in 2. It's either mate in 2 or 3, isn't it? Let's face it. So yeah, none of that's any good. So the player with the white pieces obviously saw this position from the original position. They saw they could get this position when they were here, but just rejected it because they were like, well, I can get this position, but rook b8 check doesn't lead anywhere. King g6 doesn't lead anywhere. King f6 doesn't lead anywhere. It's pointless. So they just did something passive and lost the game. But this king being on the edge, you've still got enough to draw it. And it's this king g5 move. How cool is that? Really, really clever move. Black's got to be careful now. Black's only got 4 moves that don't lose the game here. So, for example, rook g8 checks, just completely lost. King f6. If the h-pawn is pushed, we've got the perpetual. Black's got to come back to the back rank, and they've got to keep coming back to g7. They can't come this way with their king because white will just nab the rook and well, in the game. They're covering the h1 square. What else could black try here? I mean, there isn't really anything else to try, is there? There's just nowhere to go. The black king can't go this way because the rook drops. If it goes this way, it can, but it's just the same perpetual. The engine reckons that black should just push this pawn because there's nothing that they can do. It's just a draw. So how about that? This position from a 1991 game just got lost in a very formulaic sort of passive defense. Just a sort of, you know, I'd come away from a game like that just feeling a little bit sort of disappointed in myself that I didn't try something. I mean, most of the time you then chuck it in the engine and there wasn't anything you could try and you sort of feel, all right, okay. But there was something there. Yeah, so could we be the player that finds that something there? King g5. Anyway, 4 excellent positions demonstrating king is on the edge and how that can be used to an advantage. In most of the cases it was gaining a draw, I think, but in that first sort of immortal Capablanca position, king g3, just let the pawns drop all over the place. Let's finish the video here with this 3 pawns gone and black is toast, even though white has 3 pawns gone. Right, I think that's enough from me. That's just over half an hour.